Okay, so thanks, Mike, for that very interesting perspective. We'll be providing a slightly different perspective, and my colleague Farah Mohamed and I will be presenting today on behalf of Dr. Edna Ayanzadel, who was the principal investigator for this work as part of the Genome Canada grant on knowledge translation in health systems. So we've been examining the online practices of direct-to-consumer advertising companies who are engaging in genetic testing for a number of years. We focused on genetic testing for the purposes related to health and well-being, for the purposes of our studies, not particularly ancestry testing or paternity or genetic tests for reasons other than health and well-being. Now, listed here are some of the kinds of messages that prompted us originally to undertake our work. Proponents of direct-to-consumer advertising often claim that these advertisements serve an educational purpose, they fill a niche in that sense, and that they're empowering to the consumer. Critics, on the other hand, claim that there's premature information being offered here that's difficult to interpret at best, and at worst may have limited or no clinical validity, and may be potentially harmful to people if it's in case that it isn't misinterpreted or falls into the wrong hands. Now, quite a bit of critical literature has been emerging in the past 5 years since we first began undertaking this work in 2004, and we believe that it has had some impact on the practices of these companies. Companies are beginning to use more careful language, for example, in promoting their tests. Some of them are turning away from direct-to-consumer advertising altogether, focusing more on advertising directly to clinicians. However, there is also evidence that these companies are doing quite well and that there is a stable and growing base for consumers who are interested in this kind of test. Who are these first wave of users? That's research that needs to be done to understand more what kinds of people are using these tests, and I think Mike shed a little bit of insight on that initially, and that's in tune with some of the research that I have seen being presented, is that the initial wave of users are quite educated users, they're quite engaged users, but how is this going to be if it ever sort of gets adopted by the broader, more lay community of users? How is this information going to be used? So we're not going to be going over the findings of our very earliest study in 2005, which looked at access to genetic tests and exactly how these companies are providing genetic counseling, if physician mediation is required and such. But I'll be going over the results of work we did in 2007 that focused on the following questions. Namely, how are the clinical value and limitations of these genetic tests being framed in the online advertisements? And what strategies are being used to establish credibility by these companies when they're dealing with a lay audience? And we followed up on these questions this year by asking more specifically, how are these companies protecting the privacy of the health information that they collect, or how are they purporting to protect the privacy of this information? And how are various elements of consent being addressed by these companies? So in order to do this for both studies, we use a snowball sampling strategy, using largely the same set as we used the first time, and trying to modify it and update it for companies that, for example, have gone out of business or are no longer offering the same kinds of services. So we tried to emulate a consumer search strategy by entering key search terms into a Google search engine, and companies were included in our sample if they implicitly or explicitly engaged in direct-to-consumer advertising. So once identified, we selected the genetic tests that were most representative of the kinds of tests that these companies were offering, and then we used the advertisements for these particular tests to develop themes. And of our themes, then, we used these themes to develop nominal categories in order to be able to better characterize the sample quantitatively. For example, looking at what kinds of credibility markers were being used. So we classified the broad range of tests that these companies offered into 3 broad categories, and this was just done by going through these company websites and looking at the kinds of tests they offer in 2005. And over the past 5 years, these categories have largely remained the same, but they are very loosely defined categories for the following reasons. First, I'll just begin by explaining. The first category is for high penetrance diagnostic tests for single gene disorders. That's pretty clear cut. That's been mentioned by a number of speakers today, that this is sort of the old genetic testing practice was really based on looking at those kinds of tests being offered in a very controlled clinical setting with genetic counseling, etc. The second category of tests that were being advertised direct to consumers was what we called risk assessment tests. And these tests were for moderate to low penetrance genes for multifactorial diseases that often involved not only the involvement of multiple factors, but also such as environment, nutrition, lifestyle, etc., but also multiple genes. So, for example, hereditary breast cancer, late onset Alzheimer's disease, looking at a range of moderate to lower penetrance genetic tests. And then the third category was what we loosely defined as enhancement type tests, and these were sort of screening panels offered for low penetrance genes for purposes of enhancing certain aspects of a person's lifestyle or well-being. For example, enhancing a person's nutritional profile, enhancing a person's ability to ward off cancer, for example, by altering diet, enhancing their ability to ward off premature aging and that kind of thing. So these are the categories that we came across, and we classified the tests into those categories. Now, in general, while our sample did change in this 2-year period, for example, a number of companies no longer were offering genetic tests at all. They just switched industries altogether. Some companies decided not to advertise to clinicians. Some companies underwent mergers with other companies, etc. But 75% of our sample is actually the same. We included new companies to update our sample. But you can see that the types of tests that were offered remained largely the same. The only difference is that we noticed this year that fewer companies were advertising diagnostic tests specifically to consumers. So this number actually decreased, and then this number of risk assessment tests, the number of companies advertising those increased. So you can see there's a trend towards lower penetrance genes being advertised direct to consumers. So in order to look at how genetic risk was being framed, we posed 3 questions that we as consumers may have when coming across these company websites in our purposive search. So the first question was, who is at risk? So am I at risk? Why would I want to even look at what you have to say? Does this apply to me? Secondly, even if I am at risk, why would I want to know this risk? And thirdly, okay, so you've told me why I want to know this risk. How can I find out? How are you going to tell if I have this risk or not? So in response to the first questions, we found that the companies emphasized really the genetic basis of the conditions that they were testing for, as opposed to, say, the environmental factors that may influence the condition, or the lifestyle factors, or the diet factors, etc. And the companies tended to emphasize the conditions as being common. So, for example, this quote here is about hearing loss, but a quote that would be used for breast cancer that I showed earlier was, well, it's hard to find a woman who doesn't worry that one day she'll get breast cancer, which doesn't explicitly say that breast cancer is common, but implies that breast cancer is something that women should be worried about because it is common. So those are the kinds of themes that we found in response to that question. So then we asked, well, what if we want to know why it's important for us to know this risk? And in response to this question, we found the following themes, and we've just illustrated them here again with sample quotes. So there was a sense of urgency being implied, and that if you don't take action now, it'll be too late tomorrow. Right now is the time to take this test, and taking the test was seen as akin to taking control over your own health. And there was sometimes in some of these websites, there was an emphasis on scientific literature. So there was a study, there was a genome-wide association study cited to support the application of this test. And the test, the company explained technically what the test would be actually looking for example, the particular genes that were being tested. And then we asked, well, what about in response to our third question, how is this assessment made? And these companies really indicated, the fact that it was really simple. All you have to do is really take a cheek swab, send it through the mail. We have these specialized risk assessment tools that will help you determine if this test is right for you. So, for example, one company we looked at had a breast cancer risk assessment, breast cancer test decisional tool on their website, where they asked you to answer a series of 5 questions about whether breast cancer, for example, runs in your family, if your grandmother or aunt has had it, etc. And if you answered yes to any one of those questions, then you'd be directed to a next pop-up window that said, yes, you're actually qualified for this test. That was the kind of thing that the risk assessment tools that they used on their websites, and also forms that asked you to fill out, for example, what kinds of food you eat, do you smoke, how often do you exercise. So then we said, okay, so supposing you've convinced somebody that this test is applicable to them, that in fact that it's quite simple to get this test and they're ready to take it, why should they trust you? So this is the question that Mike was posing earlier. Why should people trust you? In the online context of commerce, trust has been described as an attitude of confident expectation in an online situation of risk, that one's vulnerabilities will not in fact be exposed. So what we found here is that companies use a number of different strategies. We used 3 naive coders. So one was a member of a patient group, one had a relative who was a patient. So these are naive coders who are going into these websites, and we asked them, look at these sites and identify what factors on these sites would actually help you to establish a relationship or a feeling of trust towards this company, so as to give them your buccal swab, your genetic test results. And so what happened was we found these different themes. You can see here that themes such as professional credibility, the fact that the company has a history and it has been around for quite a while, and sometimes even publications were playing a significant role in these naive coders' ability to distinguish whether a company is actually trustworthy or credible enough to be able to provide them with your biological sample. So then we asked, in follow-up to these findings, given this was how companies were communicating the value of their genetic test, the question that was posed is, how are these companies handling the privacy and consent aspect of this picture? So once again, we asked the question, how are companies ensuring that privacy of consumers is protected, and what elements of consent are actually covered on these websites and consent forms, if they're offered at all? So only 6 of the 21 companies that we were looking at in our sample actually offered consent forms on their site. And these are the 14 elements of consent that we looked for on this website. So you can take a look here. I've drawn your attention to the highlighted parts of this table. The highlighted parts of the table show elements of consent that were mentioned in the consent form, but entirely absent in all of the 6 companies' websites in their advertisements. Some of the more practical features you can see, so very common practical elements of consent that were also covered on the websites included things that were, so how do I get my sample tested? How am I going to find out the results? These are the kinds of tests that the companies who had consent forms online were offering. So you can see it ranges from autism to cancer drug pharmacogenetic tests to bipolar disease. So a very broad range of different types of tests for which consent forms were offered. But commonly mentioned basics in all of these consent forms were how is the testing done? What's the purpose of the genetic test? How am I going to learn the result? And that was typically through either a secure website or by mailing the test results to the consumer. These were just sort of basic, pragmatic aspects of the testing process that were really emphasized. What was rarely mentioned on the consent forms was, what are your alternatives to this test? Are there alternatives to this test? So this was one company that mentioned, this test is not the only way to look for genetic changes, and my physician may recommend this test before or after doing any other genetic tests. So this was a case in which the consumer's physician was actually overseeing the application of this test. Another thing that was rarely mentioned, either on the websites or on the consent forms, was reliability of the results. So one quote was, I understand this test result may not generate accurate results for the following reasons, and it lists a whole bunch of reasons why this may not actually be giving them an appropriate result. So referring again to analytical validity and or clinical validity. Secondary uses of the sample, again, rarely mentioned. After testing is complete, I understand that my blood, bodily fluid, and tissue specimens may be used for research, test validation, and or education, and I understand that no compensation will be given to me. This was provided just by one company. So these are the kinds of things that were hardly ever mentioned, even in consent forms, and keeping in mind that only a subset of our sample bothered to provide consent forms on their websites. Is that because they're not using consent forms? Perhaps not. It's perhaps because they're not open to maybe sharing them with someone who may not necessarily be committed to undergoing the testing process, such as a researcher who wants to do a study about it. So while we mentioned, we already mentioned that there were benefits emphasized in the advertisements themselves, but where the disclosures really came in were in the consent forms. So the risk disclosures, particularly emotional risk. One company says that this information may evoke strong emotions and has the potential to alter your life and worldview, like what Mike mentioned. So that actually prompted him to undertake the testing because he was so curious to how is this going to alter my worldview. But so this was not a very common message, though. It was only on one consent form. Other things, possibility of discrimination. This may expose you to the risk of discrimination. Again, a disclosure specifically referred to as a risk that was not mentioned on the advertisements anywhere on the website except in fine print in that consent form. And the language of limitations was very common. We found that often risks were sort of disguised as limitations, and the companies tended to stay away from the language of risks and try to use more muted language, even in the consent forms, in trying to discuss what it is that would potentially pose a barrier to the clinical or analytical validity of the results. So, for example, this is where uncertainty was being communicated. One company states, this is not a diagnostic test, it is a risk assessment test. And the 6 genes for which we're testing, it may not even be possible to estimate the effect of these variants on your health. Another company states that this test has only been validated in people of European ancestry, Caucasians of European ancestry, and so the meaning and interpretation in other racial groups is unclear, stated in fine print in the consent form. And this is probably the most interesting of them. This is not a medical service. So companies that in their advertisements are saying, taking this genetic test enables you to take control over your health, or in their consent form saying, this is not a medical service. So how does this enable me to take control over my health if this is not even, a medical kind of service? Puts the credibility of the company in question, perhaps. So my colleague is going to talk a little bit about privacy and privacy policies. We examined the consent forms as well as the privacy policies, and she's going to talk a little bit about the themes that we found in those. And then I'm going to come back to finish.
Thank you, Rose. So I'm just going to briefly discuss the results of our analysis of the privacy policies of DTC companies. As Rose previously mentioned, out of our sample of 21 companies, only 19 of them had privacy information available online. We used a bottom-up approach to coding the privacy statements, and this table illustrates major themes and sub-themes that arose during our analysis. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to take you through the sub-themes that are highlighted in yellow, which are personal health information, genetic information, and the transfer of assets or mergers. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So the 2 quotes on this slide are examples of what companies mean by personal health information and genetic information. And you can see that the descriptions companies provide can be quite technical. The second quote even goes as far as describing the building blocks of DNA, the A's, the T's, the C's, and the G's. I think what's key to note is that while these companies undoubtedly require a sample of genetic material to provide services to consumers, only 3 companies specifically mention that they'll be collecting genetic information in the privacy policy. Some direct-to-consumer companies also consider the personal health information they collect to be the property of the company. And only 4 companies describe in their privacy policies how personal health information will be handled in a business transaction, for example, a merger with another company. And I think this is especially relevant to consider the proprietary interests of personal health information in light of the current economic climate. As Rose earlier mentioned, a number of the companies in our initial sample have since undergone mergers or have gone under as well. So that's something to keep in mind.
So overall, what we'd really like to emphasize is that there is, in fact, based on our 5 years of follow-up with these companies, an indication that there's a stable to increasing market for these web-based genetic tests, and that the tests with the lower clinical validity seem to be more and more advertised more often over this past 5 years. So you saw that the number of diagnostic tests being advertised, or the number of companies advertising diagnostic tests direct to consumers, has decreased. The number of risk assessment tests for which there may or may not be consensus in the medical community about their clinical validity has increased. So these are the tests that are more likely to be offered without genetic counseling over long distance and to be advertised through the use of more emotive techniques. And furthermore, the strategies for building trust are really relying on consumers to sort of look at the scientific publications, and based on the fact that these are scientific publications in some reputable journal, be able to assess that, okay, this is a good company, I can trust their science. Now, while the ads often overemphasize the risks, the benefits, as we mentioned, it's the consent forms where the risks really come in, but not all these companies are offering consent forms, and when they are offering consent forms, not all the elements of consent are being covered. This may be a concern, and this needs to be something where industry needs to take a look and say, okay, well, we need to, establish trust in what we're trying to do, and perhaps it's good to follow a set of guidelines pertaining to obtaining informed consent. Again, we looked only at the consent forms and privacy policies, and we don't actually know what the practices of consent and privacy are in this context when a company is dealing directly with the consumer. And one of the things that needs to be emphasized if this issue is to be revisited by industry or by other academics is that these privacy policies are not providing crucial information pertaining to secondary uses of the sample, what's going to happen to these companies' databases of information, or even actual biological samples in case the company should go under, what provisions are made in that regard, and what mechanisms are there to protect confidentiality. These things were not mentioned in the consent forms often, and they're definitely not mentioned on any other part of the website in the companies we examined. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor to any questions anyone may have, and if anyone's interested, we have a couple of publications if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this work. This one just recently came out, the last one, and take any questions you have.